Hi guys, welcome back to the trauma series with me, Mayameen Meftahi. I am a qualified psychotherapist, NLP practitioner, independent advocate and fitness instructor. And I'm bringing you just a very short series of what is trauma, trying to understand the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Triggers. Today, trigger. That is triggers, right? People often say to me, well, what is a trigger? Oh, I wish I could give you a straight answer, but I guess the most straightest answer will be triggers can be anything. They can be random, they are individual, they can come at you at any point of time. And we have obvious triggers and less obvious triggers. Now, in my 7-week PTSD and anxiety trauma recovery program, which is my workbook here, I created it, I facilitated it, and I love it. So here you'll already see that here's the brain, my brain picture. I love my brain picture. Do you love my brain picture? Okay, so we have a calming, our prefrontal cortex, we have our alarm, our amygdala, and then here. Okay, so that's pretty much the concept of our brain. The prefrontal cortex, you'll always see me touch up here because that's where I associate it. We have the alarming amygdala, which can ring so loudly that it just, nothing can be heard. The calming part can't be heard through the brain. And then we have, by lowering the arousal levels of the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex is able to process the memory with all its associations, effectively neutralizing the content of the memory. The issue that we have with triggers is that we can't get through to our prefrontal cortex. It just can't be heard from the alarm. Now, we know that alarms are there to alert. Think of a fire alarm. I'm telling you, if that's going off in the background, it's going to be really hard to concentrate and you'll need to turn it off. If we think about our alarms on our phones to wake up in the morning, shut up, I need to sleep, snooze, right? So alarms are there to create a signal. Now the problem is with a trigger is an event that will elicit feelings, maybe fear, anxiety, and elicit anger and other types of distress. Triggers are not actually dangerous, though they will feel dangerous when they happen, but they are a reminder of a previous experience, a traumatic experience or a life event that will then create the trigger, and they can come so unexpectedly, and especially for survivors of post-traumatic stress disorder, where we're not used to a trigger, and so it can create a panic, a sense of alarm, and a sense of unknowing. And they come in so many forms. When people say to me, well, what form of the trigger? It can be a smell. It can be going to a place that triggers you, that has a memory activated from a previous experience. And it produces a strong surge of anxiety. And I think that's why triggers can feel really, really exhausting, because of the emotions that they can elicit, and they're so different for everyone. So please do not compare, well, if somebody's triggered from that or they're not triggered from that there's not an effective response. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you personally to how you are triggering to whatever your current state or your previous traumatic experience was. Now, learning to recognize these triggers are really the most important way to actually lessening the impact of the trigger. So that's part of a PTSD treatment, and just like I'm referring to in my workbook here that I provide in my program, it's about learning and understanding your triggers. So even if you are unsure about why the situation is being created, why is it being triggered for that, try not to overanalyze it and overthink it. As human beings, we analyze, we want logical answers to understand our emotional responses, but sometimes that just can't be done. Sometimes you just have to say, okay, that triggered me and I accept that, and now I need to understand it so that I can lessen the impact of it. And over time, once you start to do this, you really will be able to lessen the impact. I reassure you, because I have been there and I've done that. And as you all know, if you've looked at my backstory, you've read my child abuse story, you will know that I'm like a trigger magnet, right? And if I can lessen that impact, then I'm 100% sure that you can too. And then you can start implementing coping mechanisms. You can watch my other video in these series about some basic learning ways to cope, some really simple but effective techniques on how to cope with lessening that impact of that trigger. The most important thing right now, however, is to start to bring these thoughts to the conscious mind, right? To become aware of the life around you, to become aware of how it's affecting you, and to be aware of what's happening. And a major step into breaking down the wall that we've created due to our life events. And once you try to notice what these triggers, the feelings that they're eliciting, are they eliciting panic? Is it that you're scared? Is it that your body is having a physical symptom to the trigger? Because it's not just mentally, okay? This is not a mental only process. It's very, very, very physical. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that within the trauma series, because it's so, so important that we crack the myth that this is all mental. It's mind over matter. No, it's mind and it's body to deal with the matter in hand. Got me? So some triggers, as I said, are going to be obvious and some are going to be less obvious. So for example, if you've had a traumatic event in a hospital, just at the top of my head, one that would remind me would be my birth trauma. So if I then have to return back to that hospital, I'm going to start to feel anxious. I'm going to start to feel maybe a little shaking, a little panicky, because I'm having a trigger response, because something happened there that created my brain to have an alarm system. So now I have to go back to the hospital where that trauma happened, and so I have to breathe and bring myself to a grounding response that this is not that time anymore. I am through that time, but acknowledging that that's creating a trigger, right? So that's like an obvious trigger. And then we have less obvious triggers. Now I've had these and they are random. I've been walking through the supermarket, down the onion aisle, and all of a sudden I've gone into a state of panic. I'm feeling claustrophobic. I just want to get out of the supermarket. I've just had enough. I'm feeling stressed. I'm feeling agitated. And I'm like, damn, I was just walking down an onion aisle. What on earth has an onion got to do with anything that's gone on within my life? But it's just the way we sometimes respond. It could just be that there is an emotion that's sat there that we haven't dealt with before we've gone to the supermarket, right? So it's not necessarily that the supermarket with those onions are going to make me have going to impact me. It's the whole environment and the leading up to the environment that took me to that place. So it's so important that we don't kind of make ourselves feel like we're going crazy because we're triggering for things that we don't understand. What's important is that you learn to breathe and lessen the impact of the trigger. Now that's what makes them, in my opinion, so complex, because they go bang. But what makes them easier to handle is when you can just actually identify your body, you can identify the emotions and the physical symptoms that's being created in your body, so that you can implement that coping mechanism when it's needed. Triggers, they are confusing. How are you going to really understand the environment around you that's creating triggers? Well, challenge. I want you to grab a piece of paper and I want you to write down with a heading, my triggers. And over the coming weeks, I want you to start recognizing your obvious triggers and then your less obvious triggers, and just acknowledge them, right? We know that if we've been through a trauma, the first time trying to talk about it or share it with somebody is creating so much anxiety and frustration or fear, but then we can continue to talk about it and it's not creating the same trigger anymore. Oh, I'm not feeling what I felt when I first talked about that traumatic event. So it's a process of eliminating the emotion that we have attached to the trigger. And the way that we can only do that is to acknowledge them, to understand where they're coming from. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to be suddenly walking through the supermarket aisle and you'll be able to go, I know why that's triggering me. It's just that you've got to learn to listen to your body and to allow yourself. And if you're having a trigger from a big obvious trigger, because for example, you've got to go back to the doctors and there was an event that happened there and you don't feel good about it, this is where you implement a coping mechanism: breathing, grounding, safe place, dropping the body, relaxing the body. I mean, the list of coping mechanisms is endless, because it's really about knowing in order to create a purpose about how to fix it. So it seems very simple, and it maybe comes across very simple, but if you suffer with triggers, you know that this is not an easy process. But I want you to start becoming aware of yourself by writing down. I'm going to say this every single time. There is so much power in the pen. We can talk, I can talk till the sun shines, and that's not very often here. But anyway, to write it, that's a whole different story. So start journaling, right? Start diary. You've got a diary, start tracking. How did I feel that day? Like, what was my trigger? What's created that sense of anxiety that I'm just feeling really agitated, or I'm feeling really tense? And then just relax those shoulders and breathe and acknowledge you had a trigger. When you start to realize that it's not that bad, then you can start to have a more calming, peaceful way of living. So they are triggers. I hope that helps a little bit. Like I said, it's a lot more complicated than the way it comes across, and that's why in my program we would work for a whole week recognizing your triggers, avoidance and safety behaviors as a start to recognizing your responses to certain situations around you. And it isn't just about the big life events, it's about now dealing with day-to-day stuff that can actually trigger us and we don't even realize it. So I hope this has been a little bit helpful. Please come back and watch the trauma series. I'm going to try and divulge into this confusing and complex world of trauma on the hope that I can just give you some little bite-sized take-home bits of information that will help you heal, because you hear me say it time and time again that you absolutely deserve to heal and to be at a place of a little bit more calmer. So thank you for watching, and I will catch you back for the next part of my trauma series.